Hey, this is Joel Duff. Welcome back to my channel. I just had to jump on here real quick and do a really quick episode of critiquing creationism. This is Duff unscripted as well. I just watched a little bit of this video from Midwest Creation Fellowship, a recent talk just published a couple days ago on YouTube by who's this? Brian Young. According to Brian Young's website, he's a renowned speaker in creationism. I don't know how renowned he could be because you know that I know a lot of young earth creationist speakers, and I follow a lot of young earth creationist material, and I don't know Brian Young. All right, this is my first introduction to him. I mean, maybe I ran across him somewhere else. Didn't leave an impression apparently because I was like, Brian Young, I had to look him up. Anyway, I was watching this, and what caught my attention was I just recorded a video for my students. And in that video, I was responding to questions, anonymous questions from my students in the class I'm teaching this semester. And they asked me a number of different things, two of which get talked about in this particular video. And they represent exactly the misconception that I mentioned in my response to the class. In other words, so we're just going to listen to a very short clip of Brian Young, and then I want to talk about Institute for Creation Research and their recent or their ongoing research program that he's talking about. And we'll relate it to some of the questions that I got from students about this very manner. Okay, here we go.
One of the things that's amazing, I'm sure you guys have all heard about the blind cavefish. Like I said, I've been doing debates. I debated Dan Barker at the Freedom from Religion Foundation in Madison, Wisconsin here a few years back, and he was bringing up the blind cavefish. Ken Ham debated Bill Nye the Science Lie. He also was bringing up the blind cavefish. What's so big? What's the big deal about blind cavefish? Well, as the story goes, these fish, basically because they've been in the dark for so many years in caves, didn't get any sunlight, they began to lose their eyes. Their skin pigmentation or scale pigmentation went away, so they looked very pink like this. And you see, that is natural selection. That is evolution. I've never understood that. You see, I'll get back to this in a moment, but there's over 120 different types of blind cavefish. What amazes me about that is the fact that this means that each one of these had to evolve in the same way. What I was taught about evolution is chance random processes, accidents, mutations. Have you guys ever seen accidents on the freeway? I bet you have. Have you ever seen two that look exactly the same?
Okay, let's stop there. So, this is about blind cavefish. And he is showing pictures that were given to him by Institute for Creation Research because they have this new project in which they're looking at blind cavefish in order to show that natural selection is not a real thing, and that continuous environmental tracking is what organisms do. That's their name for what is really natural selection. But so here, this guy is talking about these blind cavefish, and then he mentions there's like 120 different kinds of blind cavefish. Now, the picture he's using, which you can see right off here in the corner, suggests that they're showing the variation of blind cavefish. That would not be accurate. I had to go look to see where did he get this 120 number of different kinds of blind cavefish, and I found the source, and the variety of blind cavefish is far greater than the morphological variation that's being shown in that picture. But even so, the morphological variation being shown in this picture was the variance there, right? The different sizes, shapes, colors of those fish in that picture show there's indeed a lot of different variants or a lot of different styles, right? Endpoints of this blind cavefish production from fish that formerly were not blind and lived on the surface and had pigmentation. And yet, in this little spiel here that he's giving to this audience that's riveted here, is he's saying that, oh, how does natural selection happen? Oh, I'm sorry, how does evolution happen? I was taught that it's blind chance. right? That was the question that my students had for me, is like, how can chance make, things? I mean, evolution is just chance, right? Because that's what they've heard. They've heard that evolution is just chance. It's like lots of random events, and somehow random events add up to making features of organisms and allowing organisms to adapt to their environment. And he here was reiterating almost that same kind of perception that, well, what I've been told is evolution is just chance. And here we have all these fish, right? In this picture here, we got all these blind cavefish, which I think he's implying each one of these is a different kind of blind cavefish, but actually I think these are all Mexican tetras, which are just different variants of one species. And there's like 120 other different kinds, species of blind cavefish. I'll show you those in a moment. These blind tetra are variants within a single species. And I guess what his point here is that how did blind chance, how did randomness end up making the exact same thing over and over and over again? Right? Like his point here is like, oh, have you seen an accident? I mean, if you see 5 accidents, each accident turns out differently. So if evolution is just chance happenings, chance events, random events, how do they keep coming up with the same result, right? The result here being colorless fish that are lacking eyes, because that's the same result over and over and over again from a chance event. And in his mind, this just doesn't make any sense, right? This has to be something other than chance, or something other than random stochastic events. And therefore, this is not evolution. All right, it's going to go on to explain continuous environmental tracking and the whole thing with ICR and how they believe that these events take place. But let's give him another 30 seconds, maybe a minute here, to make a little bit more of a point. See what else he's got to say.
Not a one. They always look different, don't they? Accidents don't repeat themselves. And I've never seen an accident reverse itself either, where you back up and your car...
Accidents never reverse themselves. Of course, what he's suggesting there is evolution can't go backwards, right? Once it's done something, it can't move backwards. And he's leading up to ICR suggesting that a blind cavefish can reverse itself, possibly even gain its sight back, but certainly gain its pigmentation back, right? So supposedly accidents occurred that caused them to lose their eyesight and to lose pigment, and then they regain that back. Well, I've never seen an accident that could do that. Let's continue.
Nice. I'd buy that car. Okay? But we don't see that happening. But here are these blind cavefish seeing what they look like. But what's amazing is the Institute for Creation Research has taken these blind cavefish, they took them and they stuck it in sunlight, and 30 days later, this fish looked like that. This is the same fish, a picture of the same one. 30 days! What happened to millions of years? Yeah. You see, but this is the mantra that we have heard time and time and time again throughout all of our education, schooling, everywhere we go, that evolution takes millions of years and it's mutations.
Check out this fish. All right. I mean, I think this was, to the audience, a stunning revelation, right? Here's this thing that has no pigmentation, and then 30 days later, it has pigmentation. And so this looks like a reversal, right? You had something that, in his story, original story, is the blind cavefish is a fish that lived in the light and had pigmentation. And then after living in the dark for a while, lost pigmentation. And now in just 30 days, it was able to regain its pigmentation. So how is that evolution? That's not evolution. That's these organisms tracking their environment and using things like he's going to go on to talk about epigenetics and a bunch of other phenomena and how that could explain that. I'm going to say, hey, ICR, what they've done is they've discovered phenotypic plasticity, right? They've discovered what you and I already know, and that is what I know, is that I'm pretty light-skinned right now, and I usually am, and it's the winter here in Ohio. And I'm not getting a whole lot of sun, and I have very, very light skin right now. And then in the summer, I'm going to spend a good amount of time in the sun and I'm going to get more pigmentation. And then in the next winter, I'm going to lose that pigmentation. Am I evolving? Right? Is my genome changing? No, I have genes that allow me to upregulate and downregulate various processes in order to, seemingly adapt to the environment. But this is the phenotypic plasticity, the plastic nature of some of our characters that allow us to experience different conditions and not waste energy by doing things we don't need to be doing under some other conditions. And these blind cavefish that are being worked on by ICR, they're doing the Mexican blind cavefish. It's a particular species. And what you need to know about this particular species that they're doing research on is they're not looking at blind cavefish, even though they describe these things as a species. They're not looking at blind cavefish that are all blind and then sort of taking a species and resurrecting the coloration or the pigmentation in it. They're taking a species that is mostly not blind and has pigment, lives in many different rivers and stream systems and small streams in Mexico and the southern U.S. And in some situations, these fish have gone into various caves and very dark locations, and they have progressively lost some of their pigmentation. And in some cases, some populations of this much larger species have lost their eyesight, right? And as you can see here, even have lost the ability to even make the eye, all right? And so this is just these are populations of a broader species. And I want you to also know that the blind cavefish can mate with fish that are outside of caves quite readily. They're completely compatible, and they have offspring that make pigmentation, and some of them make eyes. All right, so the genes are there. There's some variance there, and there's things that are really turning off the expression of some genes, such that they may have the genes for making aspects of the eye, but they are down regulating those such that they don't produce those particular eyes under those particular conditions. And so ICR is right that they are tracking their environment in a sense that they are adapting to those local situations. But this is not a lot more than my pigmentation changes or my adaptation to cold temperatures in the winter, right? Downregulate my sensitivity to the temperature over the winter compared to how sensitive I was the first time it got cold in the winter, right? And so these blind cavefish are very similar genetically. They're only thought to be several thousand years old in terms of how long that some of these populations have been isolated and lost these features. Now, I will note that this particular fish in this particular location that's lost its eyes is most likely due to mutations, all right? Mutations in important genes for making the eye, and those mutations don't have a detrimental effect on those populations living in that particular location because they didn't need their eyes anyway, right? That mutation would be a very negative mutation if they're living in a lighted place. But in a dark place, those mutations are not negative and therefore can be passed on to future generations and through either genetic drift or potentially natural selection, because there could be advantages to not having an eye. It takes energy in order to attempt to see, it takes energy to make an eye. And if you can redirect that energy to other aspects of the life cycle. So these fish also have other positive adaptations, like they have more, they have the capacity to have more fat. So they gain fat a little bit easier or are willing to store more fat. They are a little more sensitive to the water pressure and movement of water because they can't see. They need to have more. It's kind of like people that are blind become much more sensitive with their other sense organs, all right? Because they're making up for the fact that they're missing one sense and they have a heightened other senses as the result. And some of that is due to changes in the individual's gene regulation, or in some cases, it's actually I'm not using this portion of my brain very much. Your brain will sort of rewire in order to be able to use that portion of the brain for heightened other senses. Right? So these are all aspects that are sort of under the category of phenotypic plasticity, our ability to adapt individually to local conditions. But those adaptations to local conditions aren't necessarily like profound genetic changes in us that we then pass on to our offspring. All right, so the pigmentation thing is not a real shocker in a species in which you're just looking at separate populations that have variants of various alleles, or they're just down-regulating genes, and you can upregulate those genes and get your pigmentation to reappear. What would be more impressive is if you took a real blind cavefish, all right, separate species, one that has been isolated from its former species, all right, before it's split into two species, and has been isolated so long it no longer is reproductively, it no longer can reproduce with any other species of fish, right? So therefore, we would call that a unique species in itself, and it's completely adapted to that dark location. You take those fish out, and they're not going to just instantly, get pigmentation when taken out of the lake. Or out of this cave. What Bryant Young is doing here is, of course, he's just read the ICR literature. He's just kind of following it. I don't think he really knows much about blind cavefish. He doesn't know about their population genetics. What about this thing where he says there's 120 different kinds, all right? And I think he thinks that that variation is like in the picture he showed, but it's not. Let me show you that real quick. Like here, I'm on Wikipedia's page of just a list of blind fish. All right, and as they say, a blind fish is a fish without functional eyes. Duh, okay. Most blind fish species are found in dark habitats. Yeah, all right, that makes sense because that's the only place where they really have a chance to survive and thrive without the competition, that they would have experienced if they were in a place where there was light. But they also live in the deep ocean. There's no light way down there in the deep ocean, even deep river channels. And then, of course, underground. That would be caves. So now I go here and I look and I see that there are cartilaginous fishes. So that's like sharks that are blind. And then we have a whole series of bony fishes. And if you look at these pictures off to the side here, we've got one. This is not the same thing as the Mexican cavefish, but it's in a similar group of bony fish. And then we've got, well, you got your various deep sea angler type fish. We've got a whole bunch of crazy looking types of fish. Many of these utterly lack eyes altogether, right? And so they have complete loss of the eyes, whereas the Mexican blind cavefish, there are some populations in some caves that have missing portions of their actual physical eye. But many of them have eyes, they just can't see. So they're in lots of different stages of how much of a loss or how much of the turning off of the genes that they have experienced. But some of these other true cavefish or blind fish have utter losses of complete portions of their genome. I mean, many of these genomes have been sequenced, and they're not just, like turning off genes. They are just missing genes that they would otherwise need to make eyes. Now, in many cases, they have some genes for what they would need to develop eyes, but they're missing others, right? That suggests that they have been living in the dark for a lot longer than a Mexican cavefish, which is just a subspecies or a subpopulation of a larger species that lives in lives in the light, right? Some of these cavefish, and guess what? There's 120 of them listed here, in addition to 3 or 4 of the cartilaginous fishes. So we'll say like 123 different identified species, right? Separate species, unique species in which every member of that species is blind and cannot see. And in the vast majority of these cases, they are truly blind and have lost major components of their visual apparatus. Right? That's going to be the result of them having lost parts due to the lack of need for them in the environment that they live. All right, then let me show you one other little bit here. And because I mentioned that Institute for Creation Research is doing this thing with vision, and they're starting to publish a couple of papers on it. So the blind cavefish, right, is a model system for continuous environmental tracking and adaptive engineering. That's the name of their like replacement for natural selection. That somehow organisms are sensing their environment, and God has already placed in these organisms sensors. So they've been pre-adapted. They've been pre-given little trigger points and sensors in their bodies and inside their bodies. And when they sense that they can't see light, they then go turn off the genes or the things that they would use to make eyes and pigment, because they are sensing the environment, right? Rather than mutations knocking out genes, and then individuals that have those knocked out genes survive and have offspring, and then result in more offspring that are lacking those particular features. So this whole, let me just scroll down here. Sorry, this is like, here we have a cave fish, and here we have the surface fish. All right, so yeah, so there's fairly big differences between these. But I mean, look at different breeds of dogs, and they're all the same species, right? And they're the same species as a wolf, right? So there can be tremendous amounts of genetic diversity within a species, right? They're all compatible with each other. But obviously one domesticated dog is missing features that other domesticated dogs have, or they have completely very different alleles. If a cavefish lives in a cave long enough and is isolated from the surface population, so it doesn't have any genetic interchange, right? No gene flow, then eventually that cavefish is probably going to develop through mutations new features and new adaptations that will make it significantly different than the surface fish, and eventually probably will become a different species. And that's exactly what's happened with many, many, many other species of cavefish. They have proceeded down that trajectory, having lived in dark spaces for longer periods of time than these Mexican cavefish, which are very, very much newcomers to their environments. And they have adapted to much greater extent. See, they haven't just lost features. Many of those other cavefish, I don't know if you notice, like the angler stuff, that they are masters at deception, and they produce all kinds of other interesting features in order to capture their prey and navigate their environment. And many other cavefish have other adaptations. Some are able to crawl up the walls of caves and eat the algae off the side of them, and they have adapted fins and so forth. So if you look at their cousins, right? Their cousin species that live in under light conditions, right? They don't even have the ability to do some of those things that the cavefish have. And so at the same time, fish are losing features, right, in caves, like eyes and pigmentation. That looks like degradation of the organism. At the same time, they are expanding the range of their capacities to do other things. And both of those things can be due to mutations. And so what Brian misses here is, I mean, with his whole like, hey, evolution is just random, right? And so how could randomness make a whole bunch of different cavefish? In his mind, there's 120 different cavefish that are all made the same way, and they all look the same way. And to show you, they really don't look the same way. They have lots of different features, and they've gotten to be blind cavefish in different ways. So if you were to say, like, how did this one become a blind cavefish? Well, I mean, the overall reason is they're in the dark, and so there's going to be no incentive to maintain an eye, and so therefore it's going to degrade. Well, how does it degrade? Through mutations. Do the mutations all happen in the same spot? In other words, cavefish 1, in Australia, that's related to a type of fish there, versus cavefish 2, which is in South America, related to a different kind of fish. And you look at those two cavefish and you sequence their genome, and these types of things have already been done now. You sequence their genomes and you ask, like, where are the mutations that cause this one to lose its ability to make pigment, or lose its ability to, create the different, well, especially the pigments in the eyes? And you look at the genes, they're like, this one has a mutation here that knocked out the gene, but this other one has a mutation in a different location. In other words, they had random mutations, but those random mutations struck somewhere in the visual apparatus, which could be many different genes, especially early developmental genes, knocking out the ability to make the eye or components of the eye, or maybe just the pigment in the eye first. And then that particular mutation survived in that organism because it wasn't detrimental. And then they continued to have additional mutations and eventually lost more and more features over time. So there is a degradation of that particular feature of that organism. But if you were to line up all the mutations that occurred there and all the mutations occurred in another organism, what you find is rarely do they have the same exact mutation. They just have mutations in the same genes, but the mutations themselves were random mutations that are occurring in the genomes over time. So that is the aspect, and this is what I talked with my students about. That is the component of evolutionary processes that is random. It's stochastic. It's like there are mutations happening every time organisms reproduce, right? They're making mutations, and it's difficult. It's not really possible to predict where they are because they're basically random, right? But what's not random is after mutations have occurred, the environment selects whether that mutation is positive, neutral, or negative, and therefore results in a direction to or an outcome that's quite predictable, right? If you have positive, in this case, if you have mutations that cause the loss of eyesight in fish living in caves, that could be a beneficial mutation. And if it is beneficial, like you'd say, like, well, not being able to see means they're not wasting their energy trying to see in an environment where they can't see. And so that might have a positive benefit for that organism. If you could determine that really is a positive benefit, then you can absolutely predict that it will preserve that mutation, and that mutation will become more common in the population because that particular individual will have more offspring and reproduce that particular mutation more, all right, or pass it down more. And so you can predict the direction of that particular, what that organism is going to do. And in general, you can predict that fish are going to lose their ability to see if you put them in the dark for long enough, right? That is a perfectly reasonable prediction that I would expect any student to be able to come up with, a hypothesis. So let me go real quick back to the video, because there's one other little bit of this video I want to show you that relates to some things that I've been thinking about and I've talked about quite a bit lately. So a little more of this video.
A picture of the same one. 30 days. What happened to millions of years? Yeah. You see, but this is the mantra that we have heard time and time and time again throughout all of our education, schooling, everywhere we go, that evolution takes millions of years and its mutations. And I credit...
Okay, I mean, the millions of years is obviously an exaggeration. I mean, yes, every time somebody mentions evolution, it was millions and millions and millions of years, but really this is thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, or thousands of generations. That's plenty of time to generate a blind cavefish. And he later, I don't think I'm gonna be able to pick it out of this video, he suggests that even though he admits that the fish that regain some of its pigmentation in their experiment didn't regain its eyesight, right? Which I'm not surprised by, right? Regaining the pigmentation is not shocking to me at all because of what I just said about phenotypic plasticity and just regulation, up and down regulation of genes in different environments that is controlled by the individual. But lack of eyesight, especially when you have a whole population in which they all don't have eyesight, that's typically going to be the result of mutations. And therefore, in order for it to regain its eyesight, you would have to have the reverse mutation of a particular mutation that's knocking that eyesight out. Now that, I will admit, would be very difficult. I would not predict that would happen. It could happen, but I would not put money on that happening anytime soon, right? If they think that they're going to do an experiment where they're just going to continue to watch that fish in the light, as if the light is going to be like, stimulating them to like say, hey, I need to see again, so I'm going to get my sight back. But that is actually a prediction of continuous environmental tracking. That's a prediction of their hypothesis, right? So they do need, in a way, to show, or at least they hope they're going to show this. They want to put those fish back in the light, expose them to light for multiple generations, and see if they get their eyesight back, right? Because in their minds, they think it's just a epigenetic trigger or something that's programmed into the organism that is sensing the environment. And because they already have these sensors, they can sense the light and they can go back and they can turn on the ability to make eyes. All right. My prediction would be that most likely, even in these Mexican blind cavefish, they're likely in populations where they probably have mutations that are at high frequency in those populations, and those mutations are causing the loss of eyesight. And whatever triggers they have, ICR is going to have to suggest they have a trigger that reverses the mutation. Right? Now that really would be interesting if they discovered that. I will make another potential prediction though, because the genetics is complicated here. And I don't want to be too complicated, but I want to be fair about the different possible things that could happen here. One would be is that I mentioned that blind cavefish and pigmented cavefish living outside the caves can interbreed with each other because they're still the same species, right? They're not genetically different enough to not be able to breed with each other. And so although I'm saying that the blindness might be the result of mutations, those mutations might be, you can consider those are alleles, those are variants that are genetically part of their genome and causing them not to make eyes. But if they interbreed with other fish, they might be able to get those alleles back in their offspring. In other words, they can cross, right? And they can regain sight alleles, right? And in their offspring, and therefore have offspring that are able to see. Now, that would not be a reverse mutation. That is simply going out and getting genetic variation from another gene, from another set of organisms, right? So that's gene flow. That'd be those would be variants from one population, the ones that live outside the cave, flowing into and mixing with the cave population and resulting in some offspring having those features of those that live outside the cave. Right? Now, if what ICR does is they breed blind cavefish with each other, it's still possible that some of those might have a couple variants for being able to see, right? And they might breed them together and they might get the magic combination back again that brings together multiple variants in one progeny, right? One offspring. And that offspring can make more of an eye than their parents could. And they could be fooled into thinking that, well, look at that. This individual tracked its environment and turned its eyes back on, not realizing that they didn't track the environment. They simply were the lucky recipients of genetic interchange of its two parents that happen to have, like, I've got, version A and B that work for making eyes, but I have C and D that don't work. Whereas dad has C and D that work, but has A and B that doesn't work. And so both of them can't see. But if you have offspring that combine the two together, you'd have A, B, C, and D in the offspring, and they can see. I mean, this happens with like even skin pigmentation or height, right? You have two people that are relatively short, but each one has several genes for being tall that are different from each other. And then they have offspring and they happen to get like, hey, I gave my tall variants to my offspring in the sperm, and I gave my tall versions in my egg. The two got together, and now I have more copies of the tall variants because there's multiple genes that are responsible for height. And now my offspring are taller than both of us are. That can happen with these fish as well. So what they need to do is they need to breed the fish that are blind with each other as much as possible to eliminate the genetic variation being the answer for why they might regain their eyes. Because they have to eliminate that genetic answer in order to prove their continuous environmental tracking trigger thing or epigenetics. going on. Anyway, all right, so that's a whole long complicated, those are all the different, some nuances of what could happen in this particular situation with their particular study. I've read their article, which I just showed you a part of. It is such a simple project. And there are so many other complexities to the genetics of it. They're in great danger of over-interpreting their results because they aren't testing for some of the things that are possible explanations for their data. All right. And then you get this guy coming along, Brian Young, who looks at their literature and is like, oh, this stuff's wonderful. And actually, he goes on to praise Guglielmo and ICR and saying, like, they're much better than the other creationists out there who actually believe that natural selection happens, that it's natural selection doing this, but that's not real. These organisms, the individuals are actually deciding for themselves, what to do and how to change themselves. It's not anything to do with natural selection. All right, let me see if I can find another little tidbit from this video. I know there's something else in here, but let me search for that for a moment.
One that wouldn't survive in a natural environment, right? Yeah, had nothing to do with evolution, but this is what they were trying to say is how evolution happens, when in fact what it was there was programmed information into the genetics. Nothing to do with evolving. So anyway, she says longer tails have evolved repeatedly, controlled by separate genetic loci, not a random process. Well, then it's not evolution.
Okay, I skipped way ahead, and he'd been going on and on and on about birds or dinosaurs becoming birds, and how there's these experiments that try to show that different characters could have been lost, like the bony tail, and how feathers evolved and so forth. So anyway, he's kind of railing about that stuff, but he ends up with this little quote here, and I want you to catch the very, did you hear the very last thing he said? All right, he's saying, well, okay, longer tails have evolved repeatedly, they're controlled, these variations are called by different traits, and this is not a random process. And then what does he say right after that? Well, if it's not a random process, then it's not evolution, right? Because he's already committed to the idea he expressed earlier, that I showed earlier, that all processes in evolution are random processes. And here he's criticizing somebody for saying, well, this isn't a random process, of how these different characters have changed over time under the pressure of a changing environment, changing tail lengths and so forth, and vertebra loss or gain. And these evolutionary biologists are saying, well, that's not a random process of how that occurs. And he thinks, well, that's ridiculous that they say that, because that's not evolution, because it's not random. Yeah, that's how contorted or misinformed Brian is. He just doesn't understand natural selection. And now he's reading ICR materials, which I went and looked real quick at some of his other videos. Clearly very influenced by Institute for Creation Research versus, say, Answers in Genesis. And so he is totally bought into this idea that that natural selection is a mystical force, and that everything is pre-programmed by God in terms of all these mechanical switches that God has programmed all organisms with, so that they will respond individually to the environment, not that there are mutations and the environment then selects those particular mutations to for which ones are best fit for that particular organism. All right, let me see if I can find one more thing, and then we'll quit, or maybe I won't find anything.
Of organisms and for their wondrous diversity as the result of natural processes. Did you catch that? Natural selection. It's nothing but an idea, a concept. What does that idea have the power to do? Design.
All right, so here he is again, mentioning that natural selection is merely a concept, right? He doesn't seem to believe that it's actually been tested and shown to be a process that occurs to all organisms in all populations, right? Thousands and thousands and thousands of studies attest to the action of natural selection as a process. Go look in the young Earth creationist literature. And the majority of them will say that natural selection is a process, and they invoke that process for how variants that God has placed in organisms are chosen by the environment to suit and adapt organisms to different environments as the world changed after the global flood. In other words, natural selection is invoked by many young earth creationists as God's causative agent of adapting organisms or allowing organisms to adapt to changing environments. And here, Mr. Young is saying that it's merely a concept. It can do nothing. It can't design organisms. Now, the word design is a loaded term, but adapting organisms from one morphology into another in order for it to help survive better in a different environment is a better design in that other environment. And I think most young earth creationists are okay with that language in terms of natural selection shaping organisms and creating opportunities for organisms to adapt to local situations. Okay, well, I just got to quit. I mean, that's all right. I think that's enough. That's enough of Davis Young at the speaking for the creation. What was it? Midwest Creation Foundation. Yeah, they have like a sponsored talk about maybe once every 2 weeks or so. Maybe it's monthly. I can't remember. I follow their channel. And I sometimes pick it up, but I'm always like astounded that they managed to find people I've never heard of, and maybe not surprisingly, they typically have a knowledge level that's like several notches below some of the people at ICR, and I consider ICR to be kind of like the lowest bar in terms of the major young earth creationist organizations. And so what you have is ICR pumping out misinformation, like on my recent This Week in Creationism, which I just recorded, and Brian Thomas, who managed to mangle like everything that he writes about. He doesn't think about how what he's saying contradicts something else he said in a previous article. And so you take that kind of, contorted information that comes out of ICR that's often not well thought through. And then you feed it through somebody like Brian Young here, who like absorbs all that, and then he adds on to it a whole bunch of cherry pick quotes and stuff like that from other articles without looking at the original source material. And boy, do you get quite an interesting combination when it comes out of there. I can tell by the way he tells stories about dinosaurs becoming chickens and about tree rings and some of the other things I've heard him mention, that he has exclusively read the young earth creationist literature on this and pretty much misunderstood a lot of that. And so it's errors, compounding errors to the point where you get these particular videos. Yeah, that's enough of me, complaining about bad young earth creationist speakers. But all right, back to the regularly scheduled programming that I was working on, which are hopefully much more edifying videos. It's just sometimes you just have to look at this stuff and say, wow, I have to be reminded that some of the stuff is really, really bad. But that also, sorry, I'm still rambling. That also reminds me that there are much better young earth creationists, some that are more careful and some that are much more respectful to the original literature. And that makes me appreciate them so much more after watching this particular video. All right, hang in there. We'll talk to you on the other side. Bye-bye.